Good day, students. Today we're going to begin looking at what Americans think about when they go to the polls and why they choose certain candidates over others. It could be really broken down into three different reasons. It comes down to partisan loyalty, issues, and the general likability or personality of the candidate. When it comes to partisan loyalty, most Americans will identify with one of the major parties and some more than others. This was very prominent in the mid 19th century to the mid 20th century, and somewhat reduced since Watergate with Nixon. But in that time, parties were responsible for community organization or for taking care of certain people in exchange for votes. That wasn't uncommon in some of the political bosses in Chicago or New York to make sure that constituents got access to utilities or access to a meal in exchange for a vote. Now, you might see that as corrupt, but parties had a much more of a bigger influence on voters than it does today. Even still, however, one of the ways we found in studies that parents have an influence on children is actually through parties. So that established a long history of people being from families that were solidly Republican or solidly Democrat, and they continue to hold those ideologies into adulthood. The influence of political parties is less pronounced in presidential election cycles every 4 years, but it's more prominent in biannual elections. In elections where local issues or local voters are being considered, or where senators or congressmen are up for vote. Typically, if a district or a county or a state has more Republicans, it will stay that way. Even though there may be issues on the floor that people disagree with, it's one reason why the House of Representatives will probably be Republican for the next 10 years, because many of those representatives obviously are benefiting from gerrymandering, but also they're coming from areas that are more solidly Republican, and this just comes down to partisan loyalty than anything else. And we can see this even more too in winner-take-all states. You're not going to see Republicans campaign very heavily for Senate or for Congress or even for president in states like Alabama or Mississippi. Or you're not going to see Democrats campaign in solid blue states like California or New York. They're just not going to campaign there because most people there are identifying with one party or the other, and therefore they don't need to win over people for a party because they know the partisan loyalty is going to come into play. Like I said, this is an area where parents have a huge influence on children, but it's also an informational shortcut. You typically, if a voter shows up to a polling place, and might not know anything about a candidate, but they know something about the parties, they're going to vote based on the party. The second issue is issues and policy, and this is where voters may choose a candidate based on the positions they take. And in the last two election cycles, 2012 and 2008 presidential election cycles, the economy was a highlight. So people voted based on, at least when it came to presidential issues, who's best able to handle the economy. And they really in 2008 most voters viewed the Bush administration at fault for the recession that was coming, so they didn't vote for them. They thought the Democrats were better. And it was a highlight of an issue in the 2012, and many people thought Mitt Romney would have been better, but there was something else playing in that factor as well, and the fact that I don't think he had a great ground game. And they viewed maybe some of the fact that Obama was making progress on unemployment, that they thought that President Obama was doing fine handling the economy. So that was a key issue. Typically, when someone's voting on issues, they're going to look at historical positions. And they might look at how people voted in the past, if they've been in Congress, or what articles they've taken. it certainly has come up with gay rights issues and gay marriage. Both President Obama and Hillary Clinton, for example, at one point did not support it, and then they did. So people might look at that and see that as a negative, or they might see it as a good thing because they changed their minds. So it really just depends on the issue that people take. But these are one ways that they look at where a candidate stands on certain issues. Generally speaking, these issues are much more divisive than party rhetoric. So oftentimes candidates will speak in generalities about an issue. I heard on the Stephen Colbert show a few months ago, Ted Cruz, who's running for president in 2016, was asked about gay marriage, and he said, "I believe it's an issue for the states." So it's not something that's necessarily answers a question. It's something that speaks in generalities, which is fine. Candidates will do that, and the reason is because they're trying to get the most amount of votes as possible. So they will either speak in generalities or they will speak to issues that can appeal to a lot of people. They'll also encounter diversions. Oftentimes you'll see this in political debates where one candidate attacks another on a certain issue, and they'll say, well, the real corrupted issue is the Democratic or the Republican person. It just depends. That's a diversion, and it's because they don't want to come down on an issue, because issues are the most divisive, but they do matter, and they probably matter more so when it comes to the general presidential election than during biannual campaigns where partisan influence has a much bigger influence. The third thing that people vote on or choose a candidate is based on their likability. Now, what does that mean? It means, do I like this person, or do I find this person favorable? Could I have coffee with this person and enjoy it? Or could we go to a football game and enjoy it? Or could we go hunting and enjoy it? Do I think that? And both President Obama and President Bush have really benefited from the fact that they're likable, and even people on opposite sides have said, "Listen, they're a great person to hang out with." This picture from 2004 is historically one of my favorite to highlight this. At the time, Secretary of State John Kerry was running for president. And I remember coming across this picture as a contrast of, all right, who's more likable, the guy who actually knows how to throw the football, or the guy who can barely catch? And obviously, George Bush was much more likable than Kerry, even though many people did not like Bush. So sometimes people vote on that. Who do they feel like they have most in common with a candidate? And this is probably to some degree maybe why Mitt Romney might have failed in 2012 as a presidential candidate, because he was seen as this big billionaire and he couldn't relate with a lot of people. Now, whether that's true or not is up for debate, but it does show that likability is an issue. The other factor that comes into likability or personality are shared perspectives or values. You often hear, well, how are African Americans going to vote? Or how are people who are religious going to vote? And we see this in the 2016 election. At 2016, Donald Trump's heard as, especially in the primary season, of capturing a lot of the, quote, evangelical votes. But when we break down the data, we see that people that actually value religion quite a bit actually don't vote for Donald Trump, which is really interesting. So the data on likability depends on what other things they're involved with sometimes. FDR was a person who knew how to empathize with people and knew how to communicate with people. He was well known for his fireside chats, and I've talked to my grandparents on this, and they said FDR seemed like a friend to them. People will vote for a candidate if they seem like a friend. And so it does matter. It does matter in terms of electability. It doesn't matter too much in terms of policy or how they're actually going to lead. If you watched House of Cards, you can see Frank Underwood sometimes seems like a likable guy, but does some questionable things. And of course, it's a TV show, so some of it's exaggerated, but does show likability can be a factor. So these are the main reasons that people choose candidates. Some are more important than others in others' eyes, and that's what makes our country a diverse place.